So hello everyone, I am Kripa Bandhu Ghosh, one of the organizers of SAIL, and it gives me immense pleasure to introduce to you Dr. David Lewis, who is currently the Executive Vice President for AI Research Development and Ethics at the Reveal-Brainspace, Denver, Colorado, USA. So he was a researcher at AT&T Bell Lab, AT&T Labs and Bell Labs from 1992 to 2000. So his main areas of interest include information retrieval, machine learning, natural language processing, and evaluation of information systems. So from 1991 to 92, he was a research faculty at the University of Chicago. He earned his PhD in computer science at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst under the direction or supervision of Professor W. Bruce Croft, so who is, renowned for his contributions in the area of information retrieval with regard to basically designing the language models and Dr. Dave Lewis has published more than 75 scientific papers and has a lot of patents. He is a fellow of the American Association for Advancement of Science, and he was associated with the Trek Legal Track, which had a very important role in setting benchmark for evaluation in basically legal information retrieval, especially electronic discovery. So here is where I met David for the first time. So I visited Trek conference in 2011, and I also met him in Sigaya 2012. And so here we had a long chat on technology assisted review and electronic discovery. So I believe he will be talking on a similar topic in this talk. So the title of his talk, as you can see, is on modeling and minimizing costs in technology assisted review for law. So thank you very much, David, for accepting our invitation and agreeing to talk. And so I hand it over to you. So your mic is muted, David.
There we go. Sorry about that. Thanks for the invitation, Kripa. It's great to see you again, if only remotely, and great to have a chance to join this conference. So I will be talking about technology-assisted review and particularly the cost associated with that. I currently work for a company called Reveal-Brainspace, which sells software for technology-assisted review. Obviously, part of why our clients license that software is to try to reduce their costs in large-scale document review projects. And so I'll be sort of talking a little about the structure of costs in this application area. So I'll begin just by saying a little bit about what TAR is, talk about workflows, talk about the different sort of costs that one experiences in TAR workflows, and then present a new theoretical model that I developed along with Ophir Frieder and Eugene Yang at Georgetown University for understanding how costs change over time during a TAR workflow. And then I'm going to use that model to look at a couple of controversial issues in technology-assisted review, one-phase versus two-phase workflows, and what type of active learning to use, and show that this model brings some insight into what have been very fraught questions in the TAR world. And then I'll end by talking a little about some open problems in TAR. So what is TAR? It's essentially artificial intelligence supported workflows for large-scale manual document review. Sometimes also referred to as high recall review, corpus annotation, and it's related to other kinds of monitoring tasks and whatnot. And it's crucially different from just a search task, where you might be searching a collection, you want to find a lot of relevant documents, but you're typically not doing this in an industrial setting. You're not using machine learning. Also, often in these TAR tasks, you have just not one person looking for their personal interest, but a team of people who's been hired to accomplish some task. So say, find all the documents that are relevant to a legal case. It's also a little different from text classification. Text classification is typically framed as a generalization task where you have training data and then you're building a model that will be used on future data that you haven't seen yet. TAR tasks are typically transductive in the sense that you have the entire collection available. And in that sense, they're more like a standard ad hoc retrieval task. You know all the documents you care about. You are using machine learning, but you're not attempting to fully automate the task. You're attempting to help a human being accomplish the task. So it kind of is, it has aspects of both ad hoc search and text classification, but it's not the same as either. So TAR is probably most well known for its applications in the law. I think it's probably gotten the most attention and the most investment in eDiscovery or eDisclosure, which basically has to do with bringing out the evidence that's relevant to a piece of civil litigation. In the US legal system, eDiscovery is a very big deal. Companies who are involved in lawsuits spend millions of dollars potentially on eDiscovery for the case. And so it has particularly been driven as an industry in the United States. But there's many other legal applications, anti-competitiveness reviews, sunshine laws, internal investigations. And so it's a fairly broadly applicable in the law. And then, I think one of the things I find most amusing about it is both of the presidential candidates in the United States in 2016 were caught up in eDiscovery issues. So far, Joe Biden hasn't, but his term is still young. It may well happen. So it's a very high-profile application area. TAR is also applied in many other areas. Probably the next most sort of famous area would be systematic reviews in medicine, where you're attempting to find, say, all the published clinical trials of a particular drug, things like that. TAR has become very heavily used there. But also patent search, corpus annotation, filtering social media. So there's quite a variety of applications where you have human beings who are doing some sort of monitoring, coding, reviewing of documents, and one wants to make them more efficient using AI. So basically, you've got two goals in TAR. You want to obviously minimize the cost of the review, but you could minimize the cost of the review by just not doing it. So clearly you also have some sort of goal. I'm not going to focus a lot on effectiveness in this talk, but typically you have, say, some goal for a minimum recall. That involves a whole set of other issues about random sampling and estimating of recall and things like that I won't talk about here. But it's important to keep in mind that there's some sort of minimum quality standard, and one is trying to minimize cost, with respect to meeting that standard. One can also set the problem up the other way, which is to say, okay, I have a fixed budget. How good is my effectiveness? But in this talk, I'm going to be emphasizing we have an effectiveness goal. We want to meet it for the minimum cost possible. Okay, cost has been a huge issue. In fact, cost was the driver of the emergence of the technology-assisted review technology. This is a report from the Rand Institute about 10 years ago, which was basically asking, why is eDiscovery so expensive? And the answer they came up with is, well, you have to pay all these lawyers to look at documents, and the lawyers are expensive. And we'll come back to in a bit just how expensive are the lawyers, because that actually ends up having some interesting impacts. But basically, it's about, how do we replace some of the human effort with automated effort? So a key issue in TAR is not just the technologies, and the technologies are things that you've largely heard about: supervised learning, various kinds of text representation, active learning, and things. What's kind of unique to TAR is workflow design, how you arrange this process of human beings reviewing documents with the aid of AI. So the core technology here is perhaps familiar, which is iterative active learning. And active learning is essentially the idea that you can reduce the amount of training data for a supervised learning task if you use the predictive model that you already have trained to choose the next set of training data. And so one typically envisions active learning as a kind of cyclical process where somebody labels data that's used to train a model, the model's used to choose more data, the person labels that data, and so on. It's important to look at that in a little more detail in TAR, because what we have over time is that documents are getting labeled, and that's changing the composition of or changing the labeling status of the collection. So here's a different way to kind of diagram active learning. At the left, we have say 3 documents have been labeled. We train a supervised learning system, and then active learning uses that model to select a batch, in this case 3 more documents to label, have been prioritized. The human being labels those documents, the reviewer labels those documents, and now there's 6 documents labeled in the collection. And this sort of continues until we reach some sort of stopping point. So we can then think of that as after each iteration of labeling, we have a decision to make. And the decision to make is, are we done or not? And that might be based on, say, a sample-based estimate of our effectiveness. Have we reached, say, 80% recall or so on? But we can really think of this as a kind of series of having a stopping rule. If the stopping rule says we're done, we're done. If the stopping rule says we're not done, we use active learning to identify the next batch of documents to review, and so on. And this is what I would call a one-phase TAR workflow, in the sense that we iterate the same process again and again and again until we're done. You can also, so basically, this is very much like what is called relevance feedback and information retrieval, which was invented by Rocchio back in 1965. You essentially just keep iterating active learning until you find enough good documents. And there's no the goal here is not to produce a good classifier in the way you would in text classification in a generalization framework. The goal is actually to label the documents, and the labeling of documents happen during the iterative active learning process. So then this was rediscovered. This was actually the second workflow that was introduced in eDiscovery. And we'll talk about the first one in a second. And it was essentially rediscovered around 2012. And because it was the second workflow, it's called TAR 2.0, or sometimes TAR 3.0 or 4.0 or continuous, many buzzwords associated with it. But it's basically at its heart, it's 1965 relevance feedback. So there's another approach, which actually was rolled out in eDiscovery first. And that one says that instead of testing for stopping at each point, you actually test for something different. You test for, is your classifier good enough? And if your classifier is good enough, maybe you stop this iterative active learning process and you just say, okay, I've got a good enough classifier. I'm going to use it to prioritize enough documents to be done. So in this diagram, what we're showing is that distinction, basically saying, are we going to switch to phase 2 of a 2-phase review? If the answer is no, then it keeps looking like a 1-phase review. We prioritize one batch of documents to review, and we continue on. If we say yes, our classifier is good enough, then we stop iterative active learning and we deploy the classifier. And we identify a large number of documents. And again, you may have some sample-based estimate to decide how many that should be. And then often in 2-phase reviews, we have a different set of people who then review the documents in the second phase. So in the first phase, we might say, well, okay, we're labeling these documents for training. that each document we label for training might decide the fate of thousands of other documents in the second phase. So maybe we use like a senior lawyer, say an associate, or a pair of associates, and we label the data very carefully in the first phase. But then when we're done with training and we deploy the model, maybe we now send it out to a big review team of say lower priced attorneys who are going to do this kind of mass review of the prioritized material. And so that's a kind of classic two-phase TAR review, which actually was what emerged in eDiscovery first. And so basically it's similar to active learning workflows for text classification. You know, in text classification, you would typically be in a generalization framework where you don't know the data the classifier is going to be applied to. But, you know, so this is very similar, except you're in a transductive framework where you do know the data. And this emerged in eDiscovery first because essentially it emerged by analogy to the Boolean query filters that people were using previously in eDiscovery. So before the machine learning era in eDiscovery, people would write Boolean, they still do actually in many legal cases, but they would write Boolean queries to select the documents for review. And then it was very natural to, instead of using a Boolean query, use a binary classifier that was trained by machine learning. And so this kind of emerged in eDiscovery first. And then actually the CEO of a eDiscovery company in 2014 decided to call two-phase workflows TAR 1.0 and one-phase workflows TAR 2.0 because he was promoting one-phase workflows. And that name has stuck in eDiscovery. So you may often hear the terms like TAR 1.0, which is a two-phase workflow, or TAR 2.0, which is a one-phase workflow. And you may hear that in potentially other talks in this symposium. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the kind of workflow design in TAR. Let's look a little more at the costs that are involved. So as I mentioned, in a two-phase workflow, you may have different people doing phase 1 and phase 2. You may also have different people labeling data for evaluation, though I won't be talking about that in this talk. And so you might expect, because different personnel are doing those different tasks, they may have different costs. The other thing I'm going to talk about is a little more subtle, which is that different documents may take different amounts of time to review. But let's look at personnel first. And as I said, the kind of this classic RAND report kind of focused on the cost of personnel. And there's this kind of paragraph that I always put up on screen to terrify. I don't know if there's any law students in the audience, but I always put this up because it talked about the kind of very hard for lawyers who were not able to get better jobs, often end up taking these document review jobs, which can, and now this, I don't know whether this might be a large amount of money or a small amount of money for a lawyer in India, but it's a small amount of money if you live in New York City. And so you're reviewing 100 documents an hour, 12 hours a day with no overtime pay, $25 an hour. This was a report back in 2012, 10 years ago. So you might say, well, okay, well, that doesn't happen anymore. You know, now lawyers in the United States, you know, are talking about $200,000 a year for first year salary. So I went on a job board yesterday, Indeed.com, and we see that eDiscovery reviewers are still getting as little as like $23 an hour, whereas, you know, other lawyers are getting $200,000 a year. So what you can see is that there are lawyers out there who bill at very different rates. And in a two-phase workflow, you often have the attorneys in phase 1 billing at a very high rate, and the attorney is in phase 2 be billing at a very low rate, so that the per hour cost or per document cost, probably be better to put this, is much higher in phase 1 than in phase 2. There's also often the case that, however, that there's also differences among documents. So if you think about identifying documents that are responsive to a lawsuit. And you're going through a large email collection. Maybe you've collected email from 20 different people who are potentially relevant to the lawsuit. A lot of the email will obviously be non-relevant. You can just look at the subject line. You can see it's the, hey, you want to go to lunch, here's your Amazon order, things like that. And you may be able to, as a reviewer, very quickly dispose of those as being non-relevant, or it's an engineering case and this is about sales. So very quickly you can tell that's non-relevant. Where to determine that the document is relevant to the case could be a pretty subtle legal judgment even, and you may have to read the entire message carefully. You may have to think about it, look at other messages and so on. So typically the cost of reviewing a positive document is larger than the cost to review a negative document, simply because it takes more time to confirm that it's a positive example. There may also be additional just processes that have to go on for positive examples. So something that's very common here is that in, say, civil litigation, if you're having to produce the relevant documents to our adversary counterparty in a case, you may, even if the document is on topic for the legal case, you may not have to produce it because of some privilege. So for instance, it might be an attorney-client communication, which in the United States would be protected from discovery by an attorney-client privilege. There's potentially other privileges as well. So then if a document is off topic, you don't need to worry about privilege. But if it's on topic, then there's the second decision of like, is it privileged? In which case, maybe I don't have to produce it after all. So both of these factors tend to make review of positive examples more expensive than review of negative examples. Okay, so I think what I've hopefully convinced you of is that the notion of cost, TAR is about saving costs, reducing costs for manual review. But the notion of cost is actually pretty subtle, and it has multiple components. And so what we attempted to do was try to come up with an analytic model and also just a data analysis methods that would let us understand the composition of those costs better. And that's what we're calling the cost dynamics model. So we had sort of three things that we're trying to do. We're trying to account for all the review costs. We were trying to allow comparison of different types of workflows, because there are many arguments and controversies in eDiscovery about workflow choices. And a lot of times people are comparing apples and oranges. They're comparing a workflow that was successful with a workflow that actually didn't meet its goal. And so we wanted to have a way to sort of put all workflows, whether they succeed or fail, onto a common standard. And then we also wanted to provide visualization techniques, just because we have very large amounts of data to consider. And we wanted to be able to step back, look at visualizations that let us understand at a high level the evolution of TAR workflows. So basically our approach to cost is to define, simply to break out a cost structure that explicitly defines all of the aspects. And so what we do is, the basic cost structure we look at has four components. There's costs in phase 1 versus costs in phase 2. And of course, phase 2 might or might not happen. And then there's costs for reviewing positive documents and costs for reviewing negative documents. And we basically then are interested in, as you look at different assumptions about what those four different costs are, how does that affect the optimal choice of workflow? And here's just kind of like four scenarios, all of which come up in eDiscovery. In some cases, the review project's simple enough, one person's doing the whole thing, that all the costs are the same. And so then the cost structure would just be 1, 1, 1, 1. Okay. As I mentioned, it is often the case that actually the phase 1 may be more expensive than phase 2, because we're using, say, more expensive reviewers to do the training than for review that only counts for review. And one model for that is just you have one cost for phase one for phase two, and the cost for phase one is greater. Another view is that you not only have that, but you also have a additional cost for positive documents, say for privilege review. So then that would be an addition to your phase one and phase two costs, but only for positive documents. But then a different view is, well, if you're using more elite reviewers in the first phase, maybe they're more expert lawyers. They can make the privilege decision at the same time they make the responsiveness decision. Whereas in the second phase, where you're using, say, lower paid, less experienced lawyers, then positive documents will cost more because you maybe have to go get one of those elite lawyers to make the privilege decision. So all of these are plausible scenarios in eDiscovery. I've encountered all of them in talking with clients of our company, for instance. And we'll see in a bit that they lead to very different conclusions about workflow design. The second issue is, how do we think about a review that fails? So one of the things that one sees a lot in arguments in eDiscovery, where people are talking past each other, is, for instance, there is a notion of a control set, which is a random sample you use to estimate the effectiveness of a review, and it might be used to both decide when to stop when to stop a one-phase review, or when to switch from phase one to phase two of a two-phase review. But these random samples are very expensive, and so people will compare reviews with random samples, reviews without. But then the review without maybe just fails; it doesn't achieve its goal. And so the question is, like, how do you put a successful review and a failed review on a common standard? And the way we did this is define a minimum remediation cost. And this is sort of an idealization of the penalty that you pay if your review fails to meet its target. And so for a failed one-phase review, we define that cost to be simply doing a two-phase review to the minimum depth that would let you hit your recall target, using the last model that the one-phase review trained. And then a failed two-phase review, well, what does it mean for a two-phase review to fail? It means that the second phase didn't go deep enough in the ranking. And we simply say, okay, well, we'll continue it until it hits the review. So it's a very optimistic view. The failure cost might actually be much more. An undetected failure could get you into all sorts of legal trouble, for instance. But basically, we're taking this as a kind of idealization of how you remediate a failed review. The third thing we do is then say, okay, for visualization, drawing on the notion of a remediation cost, if we now have a way to associate a sensible cost with a failed review, that also means we can associate a sensible cost, a sensible total review cost, with every possible stopping point. And that then means that we can plot the total cost of a review at every point where you might have stopped it, for instance, at the end of every batch boundary. And that end turns out to yield a remarkable array of insights into the TAR process. And so this is what we call a cost dynamics graph. And essentially what we're doing is at the iterations correspond to batches. And so we're considering, if I stopped at the end of this batch and then compute my remediation cost, what would my total cost be? And we do that for every single possible stopping point. And what you get then is you get a landscape of costs. And we then color code, sort of like a geological diagram, the contributions of the four costs to the total cost. So the height of the graph is the total cost, the total remediated cost. But if you look at the composition, the total, so the assumption, basically with the remediated cost, you succeed at every possible stopping point, but your cost varies. And so we can see, for instance, in this graph, that if we didn't use TAR at all, in this case, what we're assuming is we've started the active learning process with one training document, one random positive document. So suppose we just build a logistic regression model on one example and we use it to rank the collection. Well, basically this would be your cost to go from that ranking top down until you hit the recall goal here, which this, for instance, this was 80% recall. And what we see actually then is how that cost evolves. So actually we see like at iteration 1, and it actually gets worse. And there's actually a phenomenon called the dip in active learning, where the first couple of training iterations of active learning often make the classifier worse. And so we see that here, and that the cost actually goes up in, say, round 1. But then the cost, what you would expect is that the cost starts dropping. And the cost is dropping because we're labeling training data, and that training data is improving the model so that every example we label for training is more than paying for itself by reducing the cost of transitioning to phase 2. But then at some point, we can see around round 5 here, we reach our minimum cost. And what that says is that, and this is, I didn't put up the cost structure here, but this is an expensive training scenario. And what this is saying is that after round 5, labeling training data is no longer paying for itself. It's no longer improving the classifier enough that it's worth postponing the transition to phase 2, where review is cheaper. And you can see that because the minimum point is at a point where, whoops, I did that, sorry, oops. You can see because the minimum point is at a point where we have all 4 colors, and the red and the green are the phase 2. You can see that we're incurring we're doing a substantial amount of work in phase 2, because you can see we have this area that's red and green. And we'll see other diagrams where a one-phase review is optimal and there's no red and green at the minimum point. So that's a cost dynamics graph, which I'll be showing several of these in the rest of the talk. And we've found this to be a immensely powerful tool for understanding workflow design, stopping rules, a variety of things. So we've got a bunch of papers in the pipeline on that. Okay, and so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the cost dynamics approach to look at 2 controversies in TAR. And these are the claims that have been made. One of the claims that's been made is that this TAR 2.0, which is really relevance feedback from 1965, is better than one-phase TAR is essentially better than 2-phase TAR. And also another claim, somewhat separate, is that relevance feedback is better than classifier-oriented active learning methods for selecting batches, such as uncertainty sampling. And then the common way that in eDiscovery, these 2 things are often kind of blurred together. In the common claim is that one-phase TAR with relevance feedback, and that has been trademarked as something called continuous active learning by a commercial entity, it is a kind of uniformly superior TAR strategy that should be used in all cases. You see many people in the legal world writing blogs and things who claim these things. So, are these claims true, right? And they're not. And we can show that very easily with a cost dynamics approach. So I've given the citation, the paper, just very quickly. We did some experiments on text categorization data sets as well as the email collection. This is using regularized logistic regression, bag of words text representation. So it's very basic machine learning. We're seeding active learning by one random positive document using large batch size, the size 200, which is very common in eDiscovery. But you can see the details in the paper, which is coming out at the document engineering conference later this year. Happy to send copies to people. Okay, so let's start with the simplest case, which is uniform cost. And in this case, we find that actually one-phase relevance feedback actually is better. And this is not terribly surprising in the sense that if you are assigning the same price to all documents, positive and negative, first phase, second phase, then there's really no particular reason to favor the improving of the classifier over just finding the relevant documents. And we know that relevance feedback, iterative relevance feedback, is a good way to just kind of churn through finding the relevant documents. So what we can see in this case is that the total cost for one-phase relevance feedback is somewhat lower than the total cost for a uncertainty sampling workflow. And we can see, it's a little hard to see, it looks like there's a small amount of green and red here. That's actually just the a batch boundary issue, because we're working with finite batches of size 200. You could, in theory, do a little bit better by not reviewing the last batch, going to the second phase, and just kind of going and reviewing part of that batch. But that's somewhat an artifact of the kind of idealized cost structure that it actually normally would cost something like a random sample to decide exactly how far down to go. So as a practical matter, the optimal workflow is to do all your work in the first phase, never transition to the second phase, which is not surprising because the second phase is not cheaper. The interesting thing to look at, perhaps, though, is that the uncertainty sampling workflow actually its optimum is a little worse, but it actually finishes in a smaller number of iterations. So if you had a per iteration cost, it actually might be optimal. And then it actually does a lot of work. At the minimum, it's doing a lot of work. It's finding a lot of positive documents in the second phase. Okay, so let's look at the expensive training scenario. So this is the one where you use kind of an associate lawyer, senior associate to label training data, and then you use cheaper lawyers in the second phase. And here we're assuming there's a 10-to-1 cost ratio. Okay, so in this case, a two-phase uncertainty sampling workflow is far, far better. And again, this is not terribly surprising, even though it has been largely ignored in eDiscovery, which is that if you have the ability to, to make use of a lower priced workforce for part of the project, then you want to minimize your amount of training. And if you want to minimize your amount of training, that means you want an active learning method that's focused on improving the classifier, not just on finding relevant documents. And so we see then that the optimum here is after 12 rounds. We are, doing roughly, the cost is kind of relatively evenly balanced between the expensive first phase and the cheap second phase. For the relevance feedback workflow, it has a much, much longer iteration. It's going to like 46 iterations or so. And it is, finding most of the positive documents, the blue area here, but it's spending a lot because a positive document in phase 1 is costing you 10 times as much as a positive document in phase 2. But because it's not improving the classifier enough, it's not able to take advantage of that by quitting early. And in fact, it still ends up spending a fair bit of cost on negative examples in the second phase, just without finding any positive examples. So here, the story is completely reversed. Uncertainty sampling is much, much better. If we look at the additive scenario, it's kind of similar. Uncertainty sampling, again, two-phase uncertainty sampling is able to produce a better classifier. And indeed, the additive positive case is actually not particularly different from the other case. The total cost is different, But if you have a fixed recall goal, that means that you've committed to reviewing a fixed number of positive documents. And if your penalty for reviewing a positive document or additional work for doing a positive document is the same, then it actually can't, adding that cost doesn't actually change where the optimal workflow would be, even though it changes the total cost. So it's basically kind of it's reshuffling the landscape, moving it up and down and whatnot, but it's not actually changing the basic result. And then finally, this is kind of a more kind of extreme and unusual case, but suppose you have these elite reviewers who are in the first phase. They can make the privileged decision essentially for free. Whereas if you have to make the privileged decision in the second phase, then you've got to go spend additional effort for that. So here we actually get, kind of an interestingly different situation. Relevance feedback is better than uncertainty sampling here because you have this advantage of finding positive documents in the first phase means that you sort of get it for free, except that you're paying the expense of lawyers. But a two-phase relevance feedback review turns out to be better. So we see that, we can have sort of independently the question of is one phase or two phase better, and the question of is relevance feedback or uncertainty sampling better. And here what we actually get is we stop actually at the first, after one training batch is the optimum in this case. And we do most of the positive examples actually do end up getting reviewed in the second phase. This actually is taking a single cost structure where positives are expensive and phase one is expensive, and then looking at category difficulty. So on the left, we have a very easy category. That is, you need relatively few training examples. And we find a two-phase relevance feedback workflow is better because it's not worth, spending a lot of time. So one way to think about like this category would be, all you need is a couple of positive examples, and then you just look similarity of those positive examples. So you don't really need negative examples to kind of tune the decision boundary or anything. And so uncertainty sampling, which is trying to, be real fussy about tuning the classification boundary, is kind of beside the point because all you need is kind of similarity to your positive examples. Second case then is a medium difficulty category. And here uncertainty sampling has a very large advantage because it's a medium tough category, but it's learnable with enough positive and negative examples and appropriately chosen ones, influential ones. And we see a huge advantage for uncertainty sampling and a two-phase workflow. And then for a very hard category, which, it's very hard to even make progress on, even the best classifier is not very good, neither method is doing terribly well. Uncertainty sampling is a little better. It's able to squeeze a little bit more out of the classifier than relevance feedback. And so, in this case, we're looking at category difficulty. We've again looked at, I'll point out just one more thing visually here, which is just think about the implications of these graphs for stopping rules. So if we look at the hard case, we see it's a very broad landscape. And also if you look at the x-axis, we have many, many iterations. So it's a difficult task, but it's not terribly sensitive to where you stop. So you have a lot of leeway for your stopping rule here. If you look at the easy task, it makes a huge difference where you stop. Like if you hit the optimum, you have a very, very low cost. But if you go even a few iterations past the optimum, your cost is increasing substantially. And so not spending a lot of time talking about stopping rules, but we've found this kind of graph extremely valuable in studying stopping rules. And we've looked at that in other studies. All right, I guess there were a bunch of arrows on here I forgot about. Okay, so here's kind of a more of an aggregated sense. So this is looking at 45 RCV1 categories, which we binned by both difficulty and prevalence. And basically, essentially looking at two-phase workflows versus one-phase relevance feedback. Essentially, one-phase uncertainty sampling never makes sense, because if you're never going to use the classifier, then you don't care about finding informative examples. But if we look at basically two-phase relevance feedback and two-phase uncertainty versus one-phase relevance feedback, and how much advantage they have, and basically the only scenario where one-phase relevance feedback systematically has an advantage is under a uniform cost structure. And in every other scenario, two-phase relevance feedback and two-phase uncertainty sampling has an advantage, and which of the two has an advantage depends a little bit on the cost structure. As I said, we've been using cost dynamics analysis to look at a bunch of other questions. And I do want to say end a little bit by talking about some open questions. Stopping rules is kind of the big area of unsolved problems in eDiscovery. There's a ton of different things that are being explored there. You know, holdout samples versus trying to reuse your training data, cost minimization once you have costs for evaluation data is super interesting. And we've got another paper under review, which looks at optimal choice of sample size. So you actually now have 6 costs then. Avoiding sequential bias is a huge issue. That is, if you're using a sample to decide, if you're using sample-based estimates to decide when to stop the workflow, you're in a sequential analysis framework. And if you want to both use that estimate to stop the workflow and report that estimate, then you need to statistically adjust the estimate for the bias that was incurred by using it to decide when to stop. And it's a very old area of work in statistics dating back to World War II, and it's heavily explored in statistical quality control. But the problems in technology-assisted review are more difficult than the problems in, say, monitoring a manufacturing assembly line, because you have a changing target. You're training a classifier which is improving over time. Cost prediction is another area that's largely unexplored. One needs to somehow model learning. If you're going to say, let's say you're at iteration 2 and you're trying to predict what your total cost is going to be and maybe how many iterations you're going to go, well, you've got to have some sort of model for learning curves under active learning. There's also the question of, like, it's not just the expected cost, but what's the risk of, say, that you're going to go over a predicted cost that you told a client, say, and incur some sort of penalty for a cost overrun. So there's a huge amount of work there. Some of this gets into reinforcement learning issues also. So there's a ton of interesting problems in the area. So in summary, no one TAR workflow is optimal for all projects. That shouldn't surprise anyone, but there's been a lot of controversy about this in eDiscovery. And the key insight turns out to be kind of decomposing the cost structure into these different kind of individual costs that contribute to it. So we've got a paper coming out at the Document Engineering Conference that later this year that introduces the cost dynamics framework. I'm happy to send copies of that to people. Okay, and thank you for your attention. I think we're going to have some sort of, so I think I have to shift to a different Zoom room now for the discussion. Is that correct?
We will have some, questions. We have some time left.
Okay. So we can do some of the questions here, and then we have this other Zoom thing afterwards.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
So I must say that you look, quite, cool in the picture in the background.
Well, so this was actually a play that I went to in Chicago that was about Ada Lovelace, and they built this marvelous set. And then after the play, I went down on stage and had a friend take a picture, so I can take no credit for this set. In fact, I'm probably probably violating some sort of theatrical intellectual property by using this picture. I don't know. But yeah, I was just like so cool that I had to get a picture of that.
Yeah.
But I can take no credit for the set or the play, which was very enjoyable.
Okay. So thank you
So
for thank you
thank
for
you.
the wonderful talk. So I have possibly you can also see, I mean, two questions on the Q&A.
Okay.
So first question was asked by Milind. So the question is, wouldn't the two-phase workflow then maybe result in the same costs or maybe higher costs? I'm not sure. I mean, I think this question was asked some time back, I think after.
Okay.
So can you take this question maybe?
Okay, well, so it's hopefully, as I pointed out then later in the talk, whether a one-phase workflow or a two-phase workflow costs more depends on the cost structure. And in general, I think a reasonable summary is that if all the costs are the same, then you do want a one-phase workflow, and you want a one-phase relevance feedback workflow that just is always trying to find the relevant documents as quickly as possible. And it's when you have these more complicated cost structures that, where you have, say, cheaper reviewers in the second phase, where you want to minimize your training and take advantage of the cheaper reviewers in the second phase. And in some ways, it's somewhat analogous. You can think of text classification in a generalization framework as an extreme version of this, where you train a classifier and deploy it, and it's completely autonomous. So there's no review cost in the second phase at all. And then it's completely, then all your goal, and you assume that there's a huge amount of work to be done in the second phase. So you don't even, all you're trying to do is just kind of come up with a minimum amount of training. And that's, of course, where active learning came from. And then you deploy that classifier, and then it is free forever. Of course, it's not really free forever, but because of concept drift and things. But yeah, so I think that's hopefully the cost structure brought that out.
All right. So thank you.
Okay.
So I hope that answered the question. The second question is by Rajeshwari Sridhar. The question is, are you defining any template or restriction on the outcome of the review of a document? Does varying the review outcome result in differing costs?
So I think maybe you're talking about the definition of the categorization problem, perhaps. That, I mean, and so I talked only very abstractly about that, but say in a legal case, say a civil litigation, there would be a set of requests that one party in the case makes to the other. We want all the documents that discuss the marketing of this product, between 2018 and 2020, and we want the engineering diagrams for it, and there might be a whole bunch of different requests there, and the two sides would negotiate this, and then that would result in the definition of the classification problem. What's a responsive document and what's a non-responsive document? And that absolutely will affect the costs. And indeed, I looked a little bit about that in the slide that looks at, say, different difficulties of classification problems. And what we find is that both the prevalence, like what proportion of the collection is relevant, and the difficulty of training the classifier, like how much data does it take to take the classifier, how accurate is the classifier after you train it. Both of those things have impacts on the workflow design, and particularly they tend to have impacts on whether relevance feedback or uncertainty sampling is more effective.
Okay. And another question by Nishit Joshi. Can we apply zero-shot learning here?
Well, I mean, that's sort of interesting. Obviously, we did apply in like our experiments, we did apply one-shot learning in the sense that we have at the beginning, we have one positive example. Zero-shot learning, my understanding is that usually refers to, say, tasks where you have a large number of categories, and then you have some sort of that, and you say have done training on a large, like image recognition, you've done training on a large number of different objects or something. And then you have some sort of description of a new category. And in a information retrieval context, it's actually kind of like a query, right? It would be kind of in a text classification context, it would be not, it's hard to see this in the legal context because, say, in every case the categories are different. You might see it for I could make up an example, but I think probably an easy example is, say, newswire categorization. So let's say you have a set of categories, topical news categories, and you have trained models for those. And you maybe, like, you're in a deep learning context, so you've actually kind of, implicitly learned all sorts of feature transformations through training these different newswire categories. And then you get a new category, maybe like COVID, and you don't have any training examples to start with, but you have some words that are related to the category, and that would, say, kick off that new category in a zero-shot framework. And then you could, say, continue active learning. Indeed, I mean, you can sort of think of relevance feedback as zero-shot learning, as zero-shot active learning. I mean, you have the query, and you do ad hoc retrieval with the query, and then you continue on and do active learning starting from that, zero shot. I mean, in some sense, zero-shot classification is query-based classification, right? So that would be safe, but I think it's not usually a great match in the law. You could think of probably the situation where it come up is a law firm or legal service provider might have a bunch of categories they apply to every case. Let's say they're doing employment investigations and they're looking for, like, harassment and fraud and things like that. And then you might have some new category you have a query for, and you want to kick that off with zero-shot learning, but then eventually do more training.
So suppose some new, regulations have been passed. You see that with the advent of, technology, you see that a lot of new laws are being passed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, there is some, cybercrime law passed at some point of time, but before that, there was, nothing of that sort. So,
Okay.
do you think in such a situation, few shot, zero shot would help, or?
Well, that would be sort of analogous in the sense of, so it'd be, I guess one way you could think about it is, let's say you were in a legal service provider, again, is kind of has many projects, or maybe it's actually like a more of a monitoring situation where you're monitoring your employees if they're committing some crime. So this happens in the securities industry all the time. So if you have an ongoing monitoring and then you have a new law passed, then you would have a new thing that you're looking for. You'd have a new classification problem, and you might have no examples, say, of emails that reflect that crime, but you might have some description. You might have, like, the text of the statute itself. That probably wouldn't be a great query, but you would have something there. Essentially, zero-shot learning is you've got something that's not a training example, right? It's some sort of guidance as to what the new category is. And so, yeah, you could imagine using it in that case.
Okay, so I guess, Nishit, your question got answered. You had a follow-up question, but I think that's a part of the question which you asked initially.
Right. Yeah. That's the point of zero-shot learning, is you don't have training data, so you have something else like a query or something.
Yeah. So I think we are coming to the close of the session. So I am thanking Dave once again. And so we will call it a day. Thank you very much to all the attendees.